Beautiful, isn't it?
It's really nice.
You can hold it.
What is it?
It's a puzzle. And it's almost finished. Keep going.
So if I solve it, do I get a prize?
I do.
Welcome to Mitchoy Chats. I'm Michael J Foy.
I am Frank Mitchell.
I'm Mike DeJoya.
And tonight we discuss Hellraiser 2022 because no original titles exist in a world where Mitchoy Chats is the only podcast that you crave for your movie news. Well, not really news, but discussions. You will go to MitchoyChats.com for everything. Ooh. See, I made it spooky for the Halloween season.
Well, I wasn't even expecting it, and I got to tell you, I was really enjoying it. You started off, and I'm like, man, I really enjoy this announcer voice he's got going on right now. It's good stuff.
It's working, yes. MitchoyChats.com.
Well, I'd go there to see all of our past episodes. We just talked about Prey. We just did
Yes, we did.
I think about the length of our one top comedies episode, and just if anyone wants to listen for 2 hours to us talk about comedy films, that's where you start.
Listen, some people might. I listen to a lot of podcasts at work, so
I dig
definitely
it.
helps the time go.
Well, if you want to hear all
tonight,
three of us,
we have to go to hell, Frank.
I'm so excited because I remember when we reviewed Hellraiser was it the original Hellraiser or was it the first 3 Hellraisers?
Something like that. It was quite a while ago.
Because I remember the CD Cenobite from the third one, so I've had to. I know I saw the second one. The third one's a little hinky to me, but
yes, you mean the CD Cenobite known as CD
or CD Bite. I feel like sometimes these people drop.
They really missed an opportunity.
It really get me on a fucking some kind of marketing team somewhere. This is outrageous. But
well, yeah, I'm fascinated personally that this new Hellraiser came into fruition. So Clive Barker for the last, I honestly might be like 10 years now. It's been quite a while. He's been trying to get some sort of a reboot or remake of Hellraiser off the ground. There was a period of time it was going to be like a mini-series, like limited, like one season type of a thing. It wound up sort of morphing into what eventually just became this movie for Hulu. But it's a series that since the year 2000, basically, and actually I'm not sure about the 4th Hellraiser, that also may have been a direct-to-DVD, but I think that was the last one that somehow got pushed to theaters, like last minute.
Wait. You don't know this off the top of your head? This is shut it down.
Well,
shut it down. You're done.
I don't remember, and I failed the quiz, and I deserve the scrutiny. But certainly since certainly the last 22 years, it's been direct-to-video.
I feel like it's a quick way to get someone to pick a DVD up off the shelf. What? There's a new Pinhead flick? Let's do it.
Yeah, but, they got really bad. The last 2 did not have Doug Bradley as Pinhead. It was 2011 and 2018, and each one features a different random sort of actor. Incredibly low budget movies playing a version of Pinhead.
And didn't we discuss it once that was it the last one or the one before that? One of them was it was made because they realized, oh shit, we're gonna lose the rights if we don't make a Hellraiser movie. So we have to make a movie.
Yeah.
It was one of them. I remember reading the article, and I'm like, "You have."
Pretty sure it was the 2011 film. I believe that was the one where Dimension was like, if we don't make a movie now, we will lose the rights. So they rushed a really bad movie into production, and then just kind of slapped the Hellraiser.
Take some fucking executive office. We have this rights to Hellraiser.
You understand? We could be making money.
The hell are we doing?
Yeah, so I personally was very fascinated by somebody actually trying to make a serious attempt at rebooting this franchise. And, I mean, it's been done with so many of these other ones where they've managed to recapture that original sort of essence of what made that project either interesting or scary. And I will say up front that this movie, I think, is flawed, but I do think that it does successfully recapture what I found interesting about Hellraiser as like a concept. So many of these direct-to-video like sequels, they basically just featured repurposed scripts. And when you're repurposing a script, sometimes you wind up with gold, which is like Die Hard with a Vengeance. It might not be your favorite Die Hard movie, but goddamn, it's a great Die Hard movie. But I mean, that's originally a totally different story that gets worked into this. So it's happened, dozens of times, hundreds of times, whatever, in Hollywood, where this has actually worked out to, maybe not hundreds of times, but it has certainly worked out multiple times to a benefit. Most of the time, it does not work out very well. And I think that, Hellraiser Inferno, which is the first one in 2000, that I remember picking up a video den back in the day and watching this direct to DVD Hellraiser movie featuring the who was going to be Julia Guglia's husband in The Wedding Singer as a really evil sort of bad lieutenant type detective who goes on this bizarre like personal hell journey. And it was I remember being very baffled and just not quite understanding what was happening, and it's not pieced together very well. There's moments in it that are sort of effective, but not. So to see the trailer for this one, to see something that was at least in concept closer to what was in the novella, I was definitely intrigued. And I think they definitely took the first like 4 movies and sort of put them in a blender and kind of came up with this new one. But
and isn't that what they've been doing? Like, I feel like that was that's been the critique for the Friday the 13th film from 2009, I think it was, where they were just like, yeah, they took like the first 3 or 4 films and put them all into one. And I'm like, well, that seems like a smart idea when you have that much lore behind all your shit. And I feel like it's a smart idea here where it does the same thing. I like it. That's sort of becoming the norm.
It's not a bad idea in concept. I mean, especially when you have these franchises that have so many entries. Even some of the worst Hellraiser movies have moments that you're like, this is pretty cool, or this is pretty interesting, or that's a really interesting or kind of cool or really creepy design for a Cenobite or whatever. So I can certainly give it up to several of these sequels for having interesting ideas, but a lot of it is just executed so fucking piss poorly. And it's, really unfortunate to see like somebody like Lance Hendrickson, who went from making movies like Terminator and Near Dark and Aliens, to winding up being in Hellraiser 8, Hellworld. It's just
Hellraiser 8,
yeah.
Hellworld.
Oh, yeah. That's literally what that movie is called.
Hellworld, Hell Galaxy, Hell Universe.
Yeah, it's something else. But I don't personally at all think that it's a bad idea to take some of the best aspects or ideas from some of these previous movies and trying to mix them together when you're sort of rebooting it. But I think it obviously, like anything, like we've always talked about on the podcast, like it depends on how it's executed. So you can take some of those ideas and be like, let's find a way to maybe repurpose this in a new and exciting way versus just retreading, old territory. So it's a very fine line. And I think that this movie overall does a pretty decent job at trying to incorporate a lot of ideas from the first like 4 Hellraiser movies. But I think it suffers from kind of some of the same problems that Hellraiser 3 suffers from in its like kind of its like third act, which is
not enough DJ time.
There's just not enough DJs. There's not enough cameras. Pinhead is, he's breaking into stadiums and he's saying, "Give me the Jumbotron. I need to get the message of hell to the people." No, I think what ultimately makes, I think, the first 2 Hellraisers work so well is that the confrontations with the Cenobites are very confined. It feels overwhelming. It feels terrifying. There's sort of like wind coming out of nowhere that doesn't make sense. The room is changing around you. You're in a familiar space, but if you exit that room, you're surrounded by a labyrinth. Like, you really do feel like this is like another dimension. Like there's something, wrong at this point. Whereas when you get into Hellraiser 3, and this is fun for the kids because there will be a quiz at home. I hope everyone's got their popcorn and soda because we're really going into story time. The Cenobite that is known as Pinhead, the evil of whatever it is kind of set free in the 3rd movie from all of the rules of the box. And he spends a lot of time in the second half of that movie being able to just walk around and roam the world, so to speak, because the movie is called Hell on Earth, where the first movie is confined mostly to a house and a hospital. The second movie is confined mostly to a hospital, and then there's also some stuff with, again, another house and a labyrinth. The labyrinth is expansive, but it also feels very confined and claustrophobic. So those first 2 movies you feel very much the presence of the Cenobites. There's a real weight to it. The 3rd movie, because it's him being able to sort of do what he wants to do and go wherever, it loses some of that like intimacy and intensity, because there's scenes where the Cenobites are just sort of out in the open and in the streets, and the idea is supposed to be scary, like, oh, they can kind of go, they can do whatever now. But it kind of winds up feeling the opposite, in my opinion. I think allowing them to be in such an open space just kind of takes a lot of that terror and power away. And I feel like this new Hellraiser movie kind of winds up falling into that same kind of place somewhere in the second act. The Cenobites, the way that they interact in the world in this reboot, they're taking some of the mythology and keeping it similar or the same, and they're taking some of the mythology and changing it. And the way that the Cenobites interact with the real world in this movie, you see them a lot out in big open spaces. And I personally just think that takes a lot away from them. I think the sequences that are most effective in this new Hellraiser movie are when people are like trapped and confined in a room with these things, or they're in tight hallways and they're, trying to get away. There are some really great sequences in like the 3rd act of the movie where you're in this, it's like a big mansion, but it's sort of like a Rue Goldberg sort of situation. There's all these sort of like traps and different gates that can be opened and closed. Which kind of makes the mansion itself a little bit of like a labyrinth. But yeah, I don't know. Me and my famously long-winded points. I just feel like it takes away from some of that intensity when you give them too much space to move around in. And the way that they change the rules for the box and for the Cenobites in this new movie, I think some of the rule changes or whatever are interesting, especially seeing the box form a lot of different configurations, shapes, sizes, and then seeing how, like, if you open it certain ways, how that affects, like, there's this interesting idea that you can, like, sacrifice X amount of people, and then you can sort of, like, ask these Cenobites or this god in this other dimension for like a wish. But then of course it's like the old monkey's paw, like it's careful what you wish for, there's always going to be some sort of it's never going to be what you think it is. But I don't know. I have very conflicted feelings about this new movie. I both really liked it, and I liked its attempts to sort of get back to some of the more interesting core concepts of the novella, particularly with the design of the Cenobites in this new movie, and also with the idea of having sort of conversations, not conversations, but interacting with them a little bit more, and just the idea of bargaining, the idea of having to, I don't know, like it's hard to articulate. I'm getting, I guess, lost in my own point.
I was just going to ask you, because you when we were speaking about this earlier, you mentioned that one of the things that you enjoyed was the idea of throwing an idea out to the Cenobites of, can we do this? And they would have been around for so long that they're like, yeah, fuck it. Let's see. Let's check it out. Like, the idea that they would be open to a deal or a bargain is an interesting concept because they've been around so long. And I feel like also, like, the more we talk about it, it also does kind of aid to that, like, long-standing idea of, like, it's always a deal with the devil. It's never like the devil just comes and kills you. It's he comes up and he's like, hey, well, if you want something, I can take something too. It's like it's always an exchange. It's always a deal that has to be made. So I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because the more you talk about how they can barter with each other, the more I notice like that might be something. And that might be a little bit more of a deeper aspect to it. But Mike DeJoya, how did you feel about this latest Hellraiser entry?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty. A lot of what Mike said, I definitely agree with. One of the things I love about, and I did not dislike this movie. I did enjoy it. It does play around with like new forms of like I'm not familiar with the novella. I'm not familiar with like the written material, so I can really only just go on like the original movie and my experiences with that and with this. And so I do appreciate some of the cool like bits of mythology they maybe threw into the new one. But one of the things I loved about the first one so much, we've talked about this a lot, where the movie came out in 1987, and at that point there had been close to 10 years of slasher movies with all different kinds of characters, and Hellraiser was not a slasher movie. And one of the things I did dislike about this movie was that it did become a little bit of that like kill off all the good looking teens slasher movie. That's one of the things that kind of disappointed me with this movie a bit. And did I lose you guys? I don't think I hear anything.
No.
Nope. I'm still here.
I'm sorry. I thought I was kind of
listening intently.
So that was one of the issues I had. Like, I was a little bummed out, because one of the things I loved about the first one, Mike, you were kind of talking about how like everything was a lot more like claustrophobic. Everything felt a lot scarier. It felt a lot more dangerous. And in addition to all of that, the first movie also revolved around this very grotesque, twisted love story between two very real-looking people.
Yes.
In a dingy, like a musty, dingy house that felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. Outside of that was like this woman who's like stuck in a completely loveless marriage, and then she gets involved in this like really twisted, relationship with like her husband's brother. And so it wasn't just like all the the aspects of like the Cenobites, and they made them appear like very carefully. It wasn't all the time. And it really more so focused around that kind of twisted love story. And it was just completely different than it being a normal slasher flick.
Very, very much so. I don't mean to hijack or interrupt your point, but I feel like it reminds me of like a Stephen King story or something like that, where it's not necessarily about the Cenobites or about the haunting, but it's about the people that live in the haunted house and the shit that they are dealing with that makes the haunting that much scarier. And I think this is the same sort of thing of just like, these people are so fucked up and into their own fucked up shit that when the Cenobites are like, when all this shit unfolds, you're like, oh, and they'll fit in perfectly because of this and that. But so just like, it aids your point, and it aids the point of just, all that sort of shit. So I found that very interesting. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's all good. like I said, it did feel like kind of like this like really cool like one-off horror story that was told, as opposed to like, you know, filling in like, you know, what we need for the next big like studio blockbuster movie or blockbuster horror movie or whatnot.
Or like, so, yeah, we're like the first one, like to let you into the Cenobite universe or the Cenobite cinematic universe.
Cenobite multiverse.
Right. The CCU.
Oh, God.
But yeah, I mean, that was one of my bigger issues with it. The movie did kind of turn into another one of those, let's pick off all the good-looking teens, young adults, or whatever. And not that it was like horribly done, but it definitely did take away so much of what I did love about the original. You know, this movie's doing something, I guess, you know, on one hand, it's doing something a little different. On the other hand, it's going back to like what those types of movies typically do.
That's an ironic point. That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, like so I wasn't nuts about that. So like that was an aspect that really that kind of diminished the viewing experience for me a little bit. Another thing I wasn't crazy about, you can call it a little nitpick, but I have this, like we talked about this with Prey a little bit, but the design of the Cenobites was awesome. There was like a really cool design. Like they looked very, they were just cool. Like especially on paper. Like I'm sure when they were all drawn up and like throwing the makeup on, like there's very cool looking Cenobites in this movie. But the first movie felt like the way the Cenobites looked in the first movie, it looked like they went through agonizing hell.
Yeah.
To you know what I mean? Like it looks like they went through hell to get the image of like you just felt the torture. You just saw the torture that was like on, like it was almost like it was just part of the costume. It was part of like, you know, the out, like however they did it. And like it had just like a slimier look, a grittier look, just a scarier look, like a just like, you know what I mean? Like this movie, sometimes the costumes were just like, while the designs were really cool, it was so polished.
Clean.
Like it just looked like, yeah, it looked like a very clean looking, like, but I guess well done costume with makeup and everything. It didn't feel like they actually went through that. You know what I mean? Like there were times where it was just, you know, even like who was the main character, the Roland Voight, like he had like a whole thing coming through his chest, like a whole this mechanical like device or whatever. And I mean, it was real. I thought it was pretty like, I thought it was kind of poorly done. Like, I think it looked very silly. I think it looked like one of those, it kind of looked like one of those fake, you know, you put the sword in your chest, but like it's coming out the other side. It's like, you know, like one of those like gag.
Okay. Yeah.
Gag things. So there were moments like that where it's like there was some really awesome. I still do give them a lot of credit. There was some really cool makeup stuff. There was some really cool effects, and I really did dig it. But that kind of took me away from it a little bit too. You know, they tried to also, like, as far as like adding all the the group of teens, young adults, whatever you want to call them. They kind of played the more Evil Dead 2013 route where the main character was dealing with alcoholism. Like she was she was just getting out of she just got out of AA. She met her current boyfriend there, and they kind of like play around with that, but they kind of drop it a little bit like towards the end of the movie where it never really feels like it almost feels like they just put it in there just to kind of add some extra character weight. Which I thought it worked so much better, and it made so much more sense in Evil Dead 2013.
Well, it was a lot more well done in Evil Dead. And it's a lot more believable in Evil Dead. This movie, I just, it feels a lot more by the numbers in comparison.
Mm-hmm. No, it absolutely does. And I think that was ultimately what bothered me. I liked the new Pinhead. I thought she did a really good job. I did like her. But yeah, you know, again, like there were some interesting ideas with like the different configurations of the, like, that's where the mythology kind of like, you know, that was kind of like a really interesting like mythology to add. Like I said, I don't know if that was like specifically in the novella also, but that was like the first time I saw that, of course, was how they handled like the different configurations. So I liked that idea, but like that was more just like a cool idea. Just like if you added like those ideas in a more like, you know, again, that more darker personal story of the first Hellraiser, I probably would have like grabbed onto it a lot more even. But I just started checking out a little bit towards the end. While I did appreciate a lot of that mythology, and a lot of the effects, you know, I started kind of checking out a little bit as it became that, you know, the typical slasher in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I was with it. I mean, I definitely did not hate the movie. I do think it's worth checking out. I don't remember. I mean, 1 and 2, Hellraiser 1 and 2, I remember very well. I genuinely do love those movies. I have not seen 3 in a while. The last one I did see, as far as in the, you know, timeline or whatnot, was 6, was Hellseeker. And the last time I saw Hellseeker, I would say was probably about almost 20 years ago.
Wow, so you just don't care. So you just don't care about Hellraiser or his exploits or his problems in life. You're just like you stopped at 6.
I remembered hating 5 and 6. And after 6, I was like, all right, I'm kind of done. I think I only saw the 4th one once as well. So, you know, but I do love 1 and 2. I revisit them all the time. And I can safely say I do genuinely enjoy those viewing experiences more than I did with this, even though, yes, this is definitely the 3rd best Hellraiser. I mean, that's not really saying much, but it's also, again, it's definitely not a bad movie. I think it is worth checking out. I think depending on like who you are as a viewer, like some of the stuff like I'm talking about may not bother a lot of other people. So a lot of it.
Not. I would hope that folks would be listening to this by now, knowing of our proclivities and our aversions to certain things in movies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always gonna like shoot to the more grittier things. Like I like 70s and 80s stuff like that. I mean, I love that, of course, but not just like visually grittier, just like narratively too. You know, like again, like Hellraiser, the 1987 movie, was a very just gritty, dark, and twisted story with, you know, twisted people in a twisted looking house. It was just everything was just it just felt like much more of a confident experience. You know what I mean? It just felt much more of like a confident endeavor, like in the way it was made. And
well, I felt like in the original like first 2 movies especially, it feels very more clearly defined when the box is open and the box is closed. This movie, it's sort of like, again, like she's kind of seeing the Cenobites throughout the movie when other people can't necessarily see them sometimes. Like they never seem to sort of go away once they start to introduce them, versus where the original movie in particular, and even the second movie, is people opening the box and then there's a result of that. This movie is designed where the box never before has had a blade come out of it and cut people to sort of mark them and like something like that. Like that's not part of the mythology from the original novella. That's not the original design of the original box. You know, the concept behind the puzzle box was that you solve this. There's multiple ways that it can be solved. Mm-hmm. But once it's solved, you're opening up this portal to this hell dimension, whatever it is, and these Cenobites are going to come for you. And that's just part of what the deal is. Now, the interesting thing in the novella is that when Frank first opens the box, Frank Mitchell, podcast extraordinaire.
Yo, don't be talking about my experiences with the Cenobites in the box. That's not right.
When he first opens the box,
I love hooks. What can I say?
These Cenobites show up, and they actually essentially like ask him like, "Hey, you know what this is, right?" Like, there's sort of this interesting question of almost kind of consent in a way, like that does not really exist. It does not exist at all in the original movies. It's just once you open the box, like you're done. The only one of the few exceptions to that is in Hellraiser 2, where Dr. Chenard uses Tiffany, who is a young girl, to open this box because she's very good at solving puzzle boxes.
he wants to solve the box, but he knows the mythology of it in the context of the movie and doesn't want to essentially do that himself. So he gets her to do it. When the Cenobites enter the room, like, they're basically going to attack her, but then they stop the process, essentially realizing that, like, okay, she's not the one who did this. It's her hands that opened the box, but it's not her desire that opened the box. So it's sort of curious how they look and analyze, like, the intent behind what is, you know, what you're doing.
It's almost scarier that way, because it's like even the people who manipulate others can't hide behind things of like, oh, well, I'll get someone else to do it. It'd be like, well, we know that it was not your intention to open the box. It was, and that's the thing. It's like they can see that. They have that ability to see past that, which is neat because like most like, and it's funny we talk about how this isn't a slasher film or anything like that, but when you apply slasher thoughts to it, it makes it that much scarier when you're like, all right, well, let's say I'm in this situation. They know what my intent is. Like they know in my heart of hearts what I fear and what I don't want and what I do want. And it's like there is a intense fear and scary to that I feel like is absent in all the other slasher or horror films that you would be able to see at the time or anything like that. And it's like that's what makes them uniquely scary, is they can see you for all that you are and all that you want to be. And that's a creepy concept.
Yeah, I think that's why a lot of people, a lot of younger people in the 80s identified with the Nightmare on Elm Street series, because you look at those first initial films and they were kids going through real problems. And they were, of course, obviously dressed up in horror. But, I mean, that's usually the best horror movies are dramas that are, you know, horrific and get really intense and scary and everything else. But, you know, first Nightmare on Elm Street, Nancy's dealing with parents of divorce and alcoholism, and Nightmare 3, you've got several different teens in a hospital who have all had issues with their parents and believing them, and drug issues and all kinds of things. And, you know, Hellraiser, I think, does work best when its characters are complicated, and sort of watching the intent of how people are all sort of working with each other, against each other, for each other, and you know what people are fighting for. You look at the original Hellraiser, and the idea that Julia is going to help this like weird monster that's like living up in the attic. It seems like crazy, but it's an interesting temptation of the devil, and this lust that she had for him before, and you know, those are always the most interesting and you know, factors when it comes to any horror movie. And I do think that this new Hellraiser did make an attempt to, you know, to do something like that. It tried to at least create some sort of, you know, interesting character stuff and something to sort of latch onto in some way, shape, or form. But I do ultimately agree, though, that with a lot of the reviews, that the human characters are basically some of the most uninteresting characters in this entire new film. And the Cenobites are really the most interesting part of the movie. But there's also something that, despite their look, and despite some really interesting and amazing moments with them, there's something ultimately kind of lackluster about the Cenobites in this new movie. And it's hard to articulate, but there's just something off there for me.
Well, that was going to be my question, is did you feel that the Cenobites in this film were more like, and I know we've been using this term a lot back and forth tonight, but do you feel that they were more slasher killers in this movie and not necessarily the, what did I write here? The explorers of the further reaches of experience? Or do you think that like they kind of fell into the realm of like, oh, well, we're here to kill people. We're not here to, you know, do the weird shit that we did in 1 and 2 of the original Hellraiser. Do you feel that they were more like slasher killery and not as enlightened, for a better term?
Well, I mean, you have the original movie, and Kirsty essentially accidentally opens the box, not really knowing what it is, and she bargains with them to give her uncle up, for her own life. And that's what she does. And the Cenobites essentially turn on her at the end, and they're like, yeah, thanks for giving us Frank, but we're going to take you too. And she has to, fight to get out of there and whatever else. These Cenobites in this movie, there is a deal that's sort of reached at the end of the film where the Cenobites don't rescind on the deal, which is sort of interesting that they sort of honor that. But the structure of like the mythology with how the box can be used is a bit different. This box is specifically designed that it's going to go through like 5 or 6 different configurations, and each configuration, when it's solved, will pop out a blade, and that blade needs to be stabbed into somebody, and by doing that you mark them. The Cenobites come for that person and they take them as a sacrifice. So it's a very different concept than what the original movie was. Like the original movie is, again, you open the box, those things are coming for you. And Kirsty just happens to make a bargain and happens to, get lucky that her uncle opened this thing prior and escaped the Cenobites. So she's got like a great sort of card to play. Where Riley in this new movie, she basically gets lucky by not closing the box, like holding it a certain way, so the blade pops out and it doesn't stab her.
Yeah,
she's sort of like, oh, that's it. Yeah, and she's kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Where like every other character in the course of this new movie can't seem to get away from the blade. Everyone else gets stabbed pretty willy-nilly, I think. Even especially the end of the movie. One of the last people that gets stabbed is sort of like, you want to talk about seeing it telegraphed a billion miles away, and then the scene just keeps going and going, and you're like, oh my fucking God, like, just stab the person because we know what's going to happen already, and then lo and behold, there's a stabbing, and you're like, aha, I knew it. That aspect is definitely what makes this movie feel more like a slasher, because you wind up with more people getting killed, and you wind up having the Cenobites, come out more times throughout the story in a capacity that is similar to a slasher chasing a victim. Because now the Cenobites are emerging, they have to come for this sacrifice, and there's like 5 sacrifices that you need to make in order to be able to get an audience with Leviathan, which is the same evil god concept that was introduced in Hellraiser 2.
I'll come for your sacrifice.
You know it. And in this movie, this box is, if you sacrifice that amount of people or whatever, you get an audience with this evil god, and you can basically, you can make, it's like one of like 5 or 6 different choices that you can make. And it's like, you're choosing like power, love, resurrection, lament. Like there's a whole slew of them. But then they obviously produce different results, and it's sort of these like dark, twisted wishes that you make with these Cenobites, and they give you something that is, by our standards, is horrific and painful and horrible, but to them is a weird mixture of these pleasures and pains and blah 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 blah. But that is it's radically different than what was done prior.
So does Leviathan? Does he take like business proposals? Or is it strictly like I got to play?
He was famously on season 13 of Shark Tank, but he's no longer taking any proposals.
Good for it, I should say. Good for them. Good for it. Good for them. Good for them.
It's a weird giant block in the sky. So
okay, good for them.
Good for it.
Good for all the shapes of the world, I'll say.
So I do agree with Mike DeGioia, though, that I do think that it kind of, it sort of takes away from the movie in some respects, because I think some of the later Hellraiser movies kind of suffered from the same problem of trying to have a story where like you're kind of not making excuses for the Cenobites to show up, but it's like we kind of have to have them pop up at minute 15 and have them pop up at minute 20 and whatever the fuck the breakdown's going to be. But a lot of like the later Hellraiser movies, as they got worse and worse, definitely lost all narrative. And any narrative that they did have was very muddled and usually was very much a retread of anything that had been done prior. And it just got very uninteresting and became very much that generic, like, how many kills, are we going to get on screen for this movie? And this movie this movie did a better job at not having people die constantly for like no reason, like just for a kill. But and there's one kill of a Cenobite in the movie that is particularly interesting, but it kind of loses a lot of that momentum that it has going for it in the third act. It starts to feel like the movie doesn't quite know what it wants to do. It kind of feels like it's like meandering and kind of just like, kind of biding its time. I don't know. It's I feel like the very end of the movie, since we're obviously just going to keep ripping this apart, just like Pinhead rips apart souls. The end of the movie ends with Voight becoming a new Cenobite and going through this process, which is something we've seen done before in Hellraiser 2. I would have preferred, kind of similar to Hellraiser 2, if that sequence that ends this film had been at the end of the second act. Because it would have, I think, it would have been more interesting. It would have created a new piece of opposition in the third act for our characters to have to contend with. But I think it also would have fixed a lot of the problems with the second act, where the second act of this movie seems like it's kind of starting to meander. It's trying to figure out what it wants to do, and it's trying to get characters like in place for the third act. So I don't know. I feel like you could have moved some pieces around and maybe made like a tighter story out of this. But I don't know. What do you think, Mike?
No, I agree with that. Because like I said, I ultimately didn't even really, I didn't really love even the design of what they did with that character, where he could have, like, as he transformed, it could have been more of a threat, with like in the third act, actually. I kind of found that whole thing a little very much unfinished by the end of the movie. Yeah. So no, I mean, I'm kind of on board with a lot of that, like it just, I just felt overall it was a decent effort, and I enjoyed watching a new Hellraiser for sure. But it did seem to just kind of have that very, like, the end it felt like it just, again, meandering, getting its concepts out there. And I think I felt that too. Like it was that moment when she goes to the house, and I guess she hears a noise downstairs, and she sees her brother. And she goes to hug him, and it's all flesh. And then it's like kind of like almost like a jump scare, like someone pulls her away, and it's her three best friends. Yeah, like her three friends, and it's just like they just show up at this house, and like at that moment, that's when I was like, okay, this is going to be the movie now. They're all going to get picked apart at the end, and it just had a very like kind of formulaic. So it's like concepts are cool, but when the concepts are kind of like integrated into like that by the numbers, sort of like narrative structure, which the movie ultimately became, that's when I like it just felt a little more. I was checking out a little bit more in that sense.
Right.
But well, it's a bummer because it seems like it's something that had a lot of potential.
Yeah,
at the end of the day, it's like it didn't really coalesce into anything that was worth taking a peek at.
I think it's worth checking out. I mean, again, the concepts and some of the visuals, I do think it's worth maybe checking out still. Like, I don't want to I'm not like shit talking it to the point where it's just like this is garbage. Like there was some work. There was work done to it that was, worthy of a look. And I wouldn't take that away.
Oh yeah, I feel like it's worth noting that whenever we're talking about something like this, when we're talking about the downfalls of it, I don't think that should indicate to people that they shouldn't watch it or shouldn't check it out. I feel like the fact that we're talking about it indicates that they should check it out, regardless of what we thought about it, just to be able to add to the conversation.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it's worth. So I don't think that by us speaking ill of it or talking about it as if it might have things that we thought it fell short on, that's a reason why people shouldn't watch it or shouldn't check it out. I think that's a reason they should check it out or should watch it. But that's just my feeling on it. But
no, absolutely.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no. That totally makes sense. But so yeah, I still recommend checking it out.
I was just going to say, it sounds like the consensus is check it out because it has some interesting stuff, and it goes a little bit further than the first ones did, but ultimately doesn't really amount to much more than what the first ones did.
Yeah, I think it's tough because I think some of the Cenobite design stuff again evokes a little bit more of what was in the novella, which is initially when Frank opens the box, there's like 3 Cenobites kind of you should be so sorry. Basically, including like the Pinhead type figure. There's like, they talk to Frank for a minute or whatever, and then they sort of like disappear or they go away or like whatever. And then Frank like kind of finds himself in a new room. The room that he finds himself in, there's this gigantic pile of like bodies in front of him that are like rotting and decayed and disgusting. Very much the grit and the pillars and the chains and things like that are very reminiscent of the original movie and the second movie, which was very much, I think, lost in this new film. Again, you get too much of these Cenobites just sort of in the real world, where they just seem to be walking around, and then there seems to be like these dancing lights on the wall to sort of indicate that there's some sort of a bridge between dimensions. But like the original movie and the second movie, like it sort of bleeds things together more. You're like in a room that you're familiar with, but now there's like pillars and chains and bodies, and this movie just, it kind of touched on that, but it never really went like full tilt into that. It was much more like the labyrinth is in the background, and it's like that there's a labyrinth somewhere out there, but no characters ever really go into it or explore it. And when I saw the trailer and I saw the labyrinth stuff in the trailer, I was like, oh, okay. So that's kind of cool because we're not going to do what we did with like the original movie and not really ever explore it. We're going to kind of get into some Hellraiser 2 territory and like get into this labyrinth a little bit. And that never really happened. And if they make a sequel to this, I'm sure that they will expand upon that and get more into that other realm. But I feel like this movie just sort of it missed the mark on that. But with the designs, Frank finds himself in this room, and then there's this woman in front of him whose skin is described as being blue, which is very much like the original female Cenobite. And like blue from like, I don't know if it's too much oxygenation or lack of oxygen, whatever, but it's like a weird color. She's described as being mostly naked, and her genitals are just completely scarred over, and she's laying on top of this pile of like skulls and bones and rotting corpses, and she's smiling at Frank, and I forget exactly what she says to him, but it's like this moment of realization that like he's I'm like fucked, like there's no escaping this. He's trapped in this space now with this thing that is going to just do whatever it wants with him. I mean, and does. But that, the fear and the intensity of that from that novella, like I'd seen the movies first, but that feels very much more of like close to what you get in those original movies, where you feel very much like trapped in a space. Mm-hmm. This movie, it's just, again, I think it's a big downfall that our main character spends the whole movie running away essentially from these Cenobites, and it's like this slow chase, slow pursuit until this final sort of confrontation she has with them, and over the course of the third act. But like, it just it feels it just feels too open. It just feels way too open. The designs are really creepy, but there's sometimes in the lighting, and sometimes I think it's a little bit of like CGI added, because I know they did a lot of practical, makeup stuff, which is great. But there's times where like those some of that makeup effect looks a little plasticky, and a little bit like you were saying earlier, kind of almost like a really great Halloween costume. Like, and it's not all the time, but it's like some of the shots I was like, ooh, that doesn't look great. But then it's interesting because so much of the movie is really dark and like hard to see. So I don't know. It's a weird movie that feels out of balance. Yeah. But I would still recommend, if you enjoy horror movies, enjoy Hellraiser, to check it out. I still think there's a lot to enjoy. I feel like, this director also directed The Ritual, which I had watched on Netflix quite a while back, and I would recommend that movie as well. It's kind of like a Blair Witchy sort of a monster kind of thing, something in the woods kind of a movie.
All right, cool. Don't you use Blair Witch as some sort of catch-all woods term? Just to I say that, I'm only teasing you, but
yeah. So I don't know. I'm curious in some ways to go back and maybe revisit a couple of the other Hellraiser sequels, but I know I'm probably going to be left disappointed, so I may not do that.
You know what you should do? You should just listen to the Motorhead song Hellraiser.
I did today, and I was so happy.
And that's really the only thing you should do, is just listen to Hellraiser by Motorhead, and you will have experienced all of the Hellraiser films. Actually, all at once.
Time.
A hook is going to come out of nowhere and hook you in your nuts.
And you're going to be hell raised.
And that's it. Your hell is going to be raised. At least 3 to 5 points.
Well, you can definitely check out our previous Hellraiser talks and everything else that we do at MitchoyChats.com. You
can do that. He's not lying. And that's what you should do, is you should stop listening to this. This is number 88, I think. Wow, we have 12 more episodes till we hit 100 episodes.
And we have so many bonus episodes that were so far past 100, but not.
It's true. That's a fair point. But we're doing this by the fucking books. We're not by the numbers, damn it. By the numbers. Numbers, by the books. We're not playing any games of, oh yeah, it's an extra episode, an extras episode. Oh yeah, I guess we'll count that as what. None of that. I hear the Monty Python little cartoon from the Holy Grail. Stop that! Stop that!
Well, until the next time that we come across the puzzle box, I'm Michael J Foy.
I am Frank Mitchell, and I'll come across every puzzle box I can come across.
I'm Mike the Joy.
And this has been Hellraiser.
What is it you pray for?